40 years ago, a small group of women in southwest Victoria set up a refuge for women escaping domestic violence. This was the 1970s, the height of the women's liberation movement. Women were demanding a fairer deal and the right to be free from abuse in their own homes. Out of the women's liberation movement came the Women's Refuge movement, a united force of women for women. They rallied and fought for funding to set up refuges, places of temporary protection and support for women and children escaping horrific home situations. The epicentre of these movements, however, was in the cities, and Warrnambool was a long way behind even acknowledging that domestic violence existed.
They didn't believe that it was happening in Warrnambool. And a lot of it was in the country, on the farms.
Domestic violence doesn't happen in Warrnambool. We are such a safe community. Who would do that in this town?
It was a shameful thing. You didn't want to go and tell people what was happening, so they just carried on and suffered.
The view of society was still that women should stay in the marriage.
Whilst we got some police on side, many police still had the attitude, we don't want to get involved.
Must be her, she's nagging. There was a lot of misconception around the causes and the drivers of family violence.
I remember we had to go out of town one night, and in the middle of the night, and there was a lady hiding behind public toilets with 3 little children, all in their nightgowns. The husband was driving around with a gun.
I got a call and I went out. This woman was in the street. Well, I couldn't recognise her face. It bashed her that much.
Although the founding members of Emma House faced resistance, disbelief and a lack of support from the community, today Emma House is the oldest and largest domestic violence service in southwest Victoria. This is the story of Emma House. It began with a discussion over morning tea in 1976 in this Warrnambool house.
Well, my first husband and I were separated, and he introduced me to this lady called Sandy, who had come back to Warrnambool from a violent situation. She was sort of stuck in the what can we do rut, and naturally. And I said, well, I don't know. I know they've got refuges in Melbourne. And I said, let's put a little letter, or it could have been an ad. And we had morning tea here at my place.
I started working at the Warrnambool in 1972, and I realised over the years there were so many people came to me with their life story about domestic violence, about all kinds of things that were happening to them, and they didn't know what to do about it. And then one day I picked up the paper, the Warrnambool Standard, and there was a meeting. Marjorie Lamb, of course, and a couple of other ladies sat around the coffee table at her house and decided that there must be somewhere for domestic violence people, and they decided that they would do something about it.
Marge recalls that morning tea was attended by 8 women. These included Victorian Women's Honour Roll recipient Delma Clapp, dedicated Labor Party member Mary Day and domestic violence survivor Sandy Byfeld. They were all smart women with a strong sense of social justice. Over the next 2 years, these women would meet regularly, gathering support and ideas. In October of 1978, the women presented a proposal to council in a public meeting at the council chambers.
And Bob Barham was lovely and agreed to open it. He was the mayor at the time, because there would have been many who wouldn't have. I spoke, and then there was women from Melbourne spoke. Then it tootled off from there.
We had a huge amount of people. The room was full, a lot of welfare people, a lot of everyday people that weren't in welfare, mothers and different ones, and that's where we formed our steering committee that night.
From this meeting, a draft constitution was drawn up. The Warrnambool Women's Refuge Group started as a collective. Members had equal say in decision-making. $1 was charged to become a member.
I went to the meeting they had and I paid me $1 to try and get started. They'd have to start with something.
A detailed submission was sent to the Victorian Government to seek funding for the refuge.
Now, in Melbourne, there was a halfway house in St Kilda that was the very first refuge opened. And we went down there, Mary Day and myself, and we stayed with them quite often, and they were just so smart. We were green, let's face it. We had no idea. They would take us into town and we marched the streets asking help for people in domestic violence, women and children.
Then for the last negotiations for the funding, it was Mary Day and I went down, and these wild women from St Kilda were in before us, and they came out in their overalls and everything, and they said, "You go in there, girls, and you get your money, and if you need anything, we're behind you." Bugger the men, they were really wild women.
It was a real battle, of course, to get things moving. Not a lot of trouble, so much from Parliament as from our own council, unfortunately. And of course, when we spoke to them, they believed that that didn't happen in Warrnambool, that was a city thing.
The women secured a small amount of funding, an establishment and operating grant of $22,000. By January 1979, the refuge was staffed and operational. There was 1 full-time and 2 part-time staff, plus 30 volunteers. The refuge was open 7 days a week.
Not many women that were first employed at Emma House had social welfare qualifications at all. It came from that life experience, yeah, and heart. That's where it came from. We talk about the ratio of volunteers in those early days to the actual paid positions, like it was triple or something like that, and holding on to the notion of that women for women.
It was amazing how many older women came out of the woodwork who'd stayed in marriages, and many from religious backgrounds. Divorce at that stage was not seen as a viable outcome of a bad marriage.
Yeah, I had a violent husband. I didn't want other women to go through what I was going through. That's another thing that drew me to domestic violence.
They had nowhere to go. They couldn't go to the family because they'd brought the family into it. Where could they go with their children? So that's why people stayed in those days. And after we opened up, people realised there was somewhere to go.
Hello, is this the Women's Refuge?
Yes, that's right.
I really need some help. My husband's locked us out of the house and I don't know what to do. My daughter's with me and I've got nowhere to go.
A total of 68 women and children used the refuge in its first 2 weeks of operation. There was an on-call system at night where phone calls were redirected to the workers' homes. As calls started to flood in for help, the volunteer and employed women put themselves in some very dangerous situations, which nowadays would be handled by the police.
I know that one of the other workers didn't have a car and they had the on-call where they'd have to go out at night time and pick people up, and Mum would be called and she'd get in the car and go and pick up the paid worker, and off they go to pick somebody up. And look, I smile at the memory because they made sure that they had their handbags with them and off they went. Some of the worry that we had as a family for her going out and picking women up or packing up their homes, and the danger of that. They had a big tandem trailer at the time that they would go in and like load up a woman's household possessions and take her off to safety.
it could be any time of night. I remember getting home and my husband saying, "You better ring the police station, they've got 2 more cases for you," you know. And quite often the police would pick them up and take them to the police station just to keep them safe until we got them. Weekends weren't good because quite often there'd be alcohol involved, and you know what that can cause.
We'd get them away as quick as possible. One day, this is down Nullawarre somewhere, and we were packing up his house, and the fella came back, and he came up and he stood that far in front of me, and he said, "And what the hell are you doing here?" And I thought, "Oh, God." And I just stood there and said, "I'm helping your wife." He said, "Well, it's time you left." And here we are, stuck out and way down in the forest. And I thought, we might have to run out of here.
In the beginning, finances were so tight that the workers and volunteers had to use their own cars and sometimes their own money. Beds were in high demand, and rather than turn women away, it wasn't unusual to pass around the hat to put someone up for the night in a hotel. It had been difficult to get a house for the refuge as none of the local real estate agents would rent one to them.
We couldn't get a house. We tried and tried and tried. They didn't want to give us anything because as far as that, some of them were concerned, we were breaking up marriages. We were taking the wives away from and their children away from their husbands. And so I had a friend here who came from South Australia and he was an estate agent, and he came here and I went to see him. And I said, "Look, can you help?" He said, "Yes, I can." He said, "I've just bought a house and you can have it." So it was a 3-bedroom house, and we painted it and done it up ourselves as best we could.
The refuge accommodated 3 families for up to 6 weeks. It was always full. The women were provided with everything they needed: food, nappies, clothes, transport and removals. Once a woman arrived at the refuge, her needs were attended to. Workers helped with visits to solicitors, doctors and hospitals, and with social security applications. The roles of the volunteers and workers were many. In a nutshell, they did everything, from maintenance and gardening to childcare and welfare work, administration, lobbying the government and writing funding submissions. Workers would even supervise visits with the fathers in local parks.
Well, it's a varying role. We can be doing anything from shifting house to picking up women and children. We're on call 24 hours a day, so it's quite a varying
busy
role.
Life.
A lot of public awareness work.
Huge stuff that they were doing, not only in supporting the person emotionally and supporting the children, and I'll have to say loving them, but a big physical job as well, you know, trucking them round from here to there, kids in and out of the cars and setting them up with food, packing up their linen and their kitchens and getting them somewhere safe. And plus coordinating all of the other services that were necessary to get, well, just some really good case management going on.
If I decide to leave, is there somewhere I can go?
At first, local women came to stay in the refuge, but it soon became apparent that it was too risky.
People weren't to know where the refuge was, which was extremely difficult in a small rural community.
There was many frightening times, I can tell you, when the man turned up at the door and you had to do something about it quick.
So they went to other refuges away from Warrnambool, and Warrnambool took in people from the city and other country areas.
They came from all over the state to Warrnambool. Some women stayed, decided to make their lives here after their time at the refuge finished. Some went back to Melbourne. Very difficult situations for women walking away from all of their support networks, particularly difficult for children coming, you know, hundreds of miles away from their school, their family, everything that they knew.
A gentleman from Melbourne found out that his wife was here with 2 children, and he picked the children up from school and they brought him back to the refuge. And he said, I know my wife's here. There was another worker there with me, a very smart worker at that. Of course, we had proper security doors and everything, and she was talking through the door. And he said, well, if she doesn't come out, I'll do something to the kids. It was really dangerous, you know. And this worker said to me, ring the police, which we did. And she said, now, she didn't wait for the police because he was getting threatening. She said, now, I'm going to open the wide door, the security door, and I want you to grab the kids. She had it all levelled out so I could get them. She said, and I'll deal with him. And I thought, oh my God, you know. But anyway, she opened the door, I grabbed the kids and threw them inside. And she said, shut the door. She jobbed him and knocked him out, straight to the chin. And by the time he came around, the police were there. So, you know, there was all, you can look back and have a bit of a laugh. It wasn't funny at the time, I suppose, but we did have a snigger after.
In the early days, the impact of family violence on children was hugely underestimated. Many children were forced into foster care.
I feel sorry for the children because they're uprooted from their houses and they've got to leave all their toys, and not that we didn't have toys or anything, but your own toys are the best.
I can remember we had two little boys with their mum from Melbourne, and it was Friday night. And I said, oh, no school tomorrow. What day is it? It's Friday, darling. Under the bed. And I called their mother in and she said, oh, look. She just stood there and cried. She just said, I didn't realise things were that bad. She said, I used to hide them under the bed every Friday night because he came home drunk. And the kids were terrified. And what we did, we tried to keep the children occupied, and that's why we had good childcare workers. And they would sit with them and help with their homework and take them out and take them to the park and different things, you know.
In 1981, the Victorian government required all refuges to have an identification name. The Warrnambool Women's Refuge Group was renamed Emma House. Due to community ignorance and attitudes around domestic violence, Emma House invested time and money into domestic violence public awareness through television, radio and newspapers.
Violence in the home is a crime. In Australia, women and children are victims of violence. You or someone close to you could be in this situation. He may threaten you, ridicule you, or force himself upon you. Children may also experience abuse from a family member or trusted family friend. There are women who listen, provide support and information and referrals. Break the silence. Speak out.
Don't be a victim anymore. Call one of these numbers now. There is someone waiting to help you with your problems.
The Emma House staff and volunteers even produced and acted in their own film named Kate, which you may notice appearing in this video from time to time.
Those statistics can help us in the future to provide better services for victims.
Right. They're Warrnambool numbers. Now there's a COLAC number you gave me too.
Throughout the 80s, they contributed to statistics, policy and research papers, resulting in greater understanding of the scope and impact of domestic violence on our women and children. In 1982, they forged a partnership with the Department of Housing and were the first regional refuge in Victoria to provide three-quarter-way housing for women and children leaving the refuge. While still supported by Emma House, the three-quarter-way houses gave the families an opportunity to learn to live on their own. In 1987, Emma House was the first domestic violence service in Victoria to purchase a house of their own for the refuge. In 1988, they started an outreach program where women could come in, talk and receive support for domestic violence without going into the refuge. In 1989, they expanded their outreach project to service women and children in rural and isolated communities, another first for domestic violence services in Victoria. Despite all these achievements, when their 10-year anniversary came around in 1989, the workers felt that it was no time for celebration. The number of women and children using the refuge in 1979 compared to 1989 showed an increase of 73%. The reporting and awareness of domestic violence was on the rise in the Western District.
You know, when I'd give my speeches, they'd say to me, oh, but that'd only be unemployed people and people on the dole, wouldn't it? Oh, you know. And I would say, no, that's not so. We've had policemen's wives, we've had solicitors' wives, we've had doctors' wives, and I always say, not from here. We've had them from other places, and they're horrified.
In 1995, Emma House moved from operating as a collective to operating under a committee of management.
The thrust behind women's services in that way back then was a consensus, which meant we were all going to be agreeing on everything, and we thought that it was a fabulous idea. In reality was that we agreed on some things because there was movement, but generally it took a really long time to get anything done at all.
I think from that there was a lot of discussion around how do we actually make this better, how do we move into kind of the late 90s with an organisation that's going to be sound and that's going to last in the community and do the job that it was set up to do. So from those discussions and discussions with the department, we moved towards the committee of management.
There was a lot more organisational stuff that the committee had to do, which was kind of ridiculous, the weight of putting in submissions for funding, writing policies, like hours and hours and hours of work.
There was at times pressure coming from the outside, and when the department decided that they were going to put the organisation up for tender, that was a bit of a tough time because obviously there was a couple of other organisations in Warrnambool who also tendered for the role of governing the organisation. But the people who were on the committee at the time were fairly passionate about keeping it as an autonomous organisation, believing that the best service delivery would come from Emma House being an entity on its own rather than being engulfed, if you like, into a larger community organisation.
Well, we ended up with a manager, which was just the most amazing thing. It was a very big transitional period of not only us having to learn to let go of those reins that we'd established and being confident that somebody was going to pick them up and run with them.
When I came to be manager, and I'd worked in the refuge, and we also had 5 transitional houses, so the women lived out in the houses as well. But all of those houses only had single beds, and apparently it was so they couldn't have the men back to the houses and sleep with them, I suppose. Let alone the women in the houses with 5 children, and how did the children get into bed with her when they were scared? So one of the first things I did was to set about getting a double bed in each of those houses so that the women could hop into bed with their children, and if their children were scared, there was plenty of room for everyone to hop into bed together. Well, the other thing that I was really, really proud of that we did was bring a solicitor through legal aid, and it was groundbreaking in Victoria. Because previously the women would come into the office and we'd say, well, you will need to go to a solicitor, and they'd go off to a solicitor. We might go with them sometimes. And often the solicitors had no idea about family violence. And so when the in-house solicitor came, a woman would come in and see her outreach worker, and she'd say, oh, he took the children last night and he hasn't brought them back. Okay, let's go and talk to our solicitor right now. No appointment, like, let's talk to our solicitor now.
For the first 20 years, the Emma House office operated out of the high security refuge. The operational side of things, alongside the address, was a secret.
We worked in the house where the women lived, in an office. That was within the refuge, and then there was an outreach office located away from the refuge. And so we did all our business from the refuge, working, almost living with the women.
Where we are now, all of the operational side is very, very separate to where the women are housed, because it's so intrusive to the women that are staying there, that there's this whole business going on as well as while they're getting their lives back together. The moving into, I think it was Fitzroy Street, was where we weren't like in the town, but we were getting closer and we were standalone, and the operational side of it was known, and it wasn't a secret anymore of where we were located. And then when we moved into Kepler Street, I can remember sort of discussion about, well, how big will we make the sign?
So I think that was, a really strong move to move the organisation that had always kind of been on the outskirts of Warrnambool, if you like, to really having a visible place in the central business district.
The term domestic violence was first used in its contemporary sense in 1973. It replaced the phrase battered wife, which was most commonly used before this. Today, family violence is most commonly used in recognising that the whole family suffers. Whether battered or blamed, the wife or partner of a violent man has often been derided as not taking enough agency in her own future, therefore implying the abuse was her fault rather than laying the blame where it should lie, with the violent man and society's acceptance of his behaviour.
For those women who were fleeing, it becomes an issue of homelessness and in some respects poverty, which is, a lot of people will often say, well, why don't they just leave? Why do they live in if the husband's beating them or in some way abusing them? But I think people don't recognise there's a lot of other underlying issues. For some women it is about, well, how do I survive financially if I leave? Where will I live if I leave?
And when they bit the bullet, left the man to live in poverty with their children and be safe, they were then blamed by society for being a burden on the taxpayer. And fancy that, there she is, a single mother. There always was, why doesn't she leave? But we at Emma House changed that lexicon, I suppose, and said, why doesn't he stop assaulting her? And so we tried to educate the public, not just the public, but the other services that we worked with, the religious organisations who provided the housing, the youth organisations, the police, the courts. We were always trying to change their perspectives as well about how not to judge women and why they find themselves in those situations, and that it wasn't their fault. So as we know, women can leave dozens and dozens of times before they finally make the break. And so it was, Emma House's and my philosophy that you give them the best possible service you can, you give them the most respectful service you can. So if they need to come back to you, if they choose to go home and they need to come back to you, they will come back to you. And they will not feel judged by our service.
The way police deal with domestic violence has changed dramatically since 1979. They now have more power to intervene, and a designated family violence unit has been established which works in strong collaboration with Emma House. Currently, in Australia, police deal with a domestic violence incident every 2 minutes.
It's now a criminal matter. I think it was still back in the 70s and the 80s, it was very much a family matter. It was kept in-house. And it was a women's issue, not a societal issue that it is now. And I think today we're really focusing on keeping the men who choose to use violence or perpetrators, we're holding them much more to account. They're the cause of the harm and they're the ones that need to actually change their behaviours.
Previously they would say it's a domestic, we can't intervene. And I'm sure lots of people know, or it's a domestic or it's just a domestic. But their laws changed, or their protocols, so that they could actually intervene.
The fact that now a perpetrator can be removed from the family home rather than the woman and her children having to escape the family home.
Despite increasing initiatives, law reforms and funding, domestic violence in Australia continues to be a desperate problem. It's estimated that 1 woman is killed on average every week at the hands of her current or former male partner.
I think the sad thing for me is that in nearly 2020 we are still seeing women dying at the hands of domestic violence, and somehow as a society we've got to try and make that stop.
I find it appalling that we aren't screaming at the rooftops that this is happening to our mothers and our sisters and our babies and our friends. It's horrific.
If 2 blokes are, not to diminish, 2 young blokes getting killed on the street by a king hit, and the laws change, but, 70 women can get killed every year in Australia, and nothing much happens. There's no outcry, there's no leaping from the rafters, Alan Jones isn't squawking from the 2GB about, domestic violence. It just baffles me that people don't see it for what it is, And not only are those women murdered, but, for example, that what happened over the weekend, a mother was murdered, a father shot himself or killed himself, and there's an 8-year-old child in the car witnessing this. So that child now does not have a mother or a father, and It's not just the woman who is killed, that is bad enough, but children are left without their mothers. Children are left to flounder on their own without their mothers all their lives. It is just criminal that we accept it, that we're not marching in the streets about it. I'm 70 years old and I grew up in it, and not all that much has changed, except there's a place like Emma House now women can go to. Whereas all my mother had was the local priest, and you can imagine what he said.
I mean, we can't step away from response, and that we need to respond to the family violence and domestic violence that's currently happening. But the prevention work, we just have to attack it from so many levels. Everyone has to play a role to make a difference to changing attitudes towards women and children. How crimes are treated against women and children as opposed to crimes against property or against men. I think it comes down to gender-based violence issues. So how we have to be able to change that view and have gender equality for it to shift. Men have to start caring and thinking as much about it as women do.
Before the refuge was formed in 1979, many women in domestic violence situations would have stuck it out, suffering intolerable abuse. Emma House has helped at least 20,000 women and 35,000 children to escape domestic violence and start new and happier lives.
I worked there for 16 years. I just loved it. I just liked the work, making women safe.
I loved working there. People would say, oh, how could you love it? But I loved it. It was good. I did good stuff every day. And often at the end of the day, we would say to each other as we left to go home, we did good today. Yes, we did.
I think the mantra of for women, by women, which is what the collective was started on, still holds true today. You know, the organisation's been throughout the years still true to that statement, where we're very lucky where we have been able to only have women working in the organisation, and it is about women supporting women.
Okay, looking forward to, from 2019 into the future, the passion that we have for the care that we give to the women and children that use our service is still there, it's strong. Our spirit is hearty. We want to forge for and make changes in society's thinking. We want to provide safe and informed care for the people that use our service.
Our absolute goal is to not be needed, and to think that after 40 years we're still here doing the same thing that the women, the foremothers, set up for us 40 years ago is disappointing, but I think we've come a long way, and we will continue hopefully to grow and expand in terms of our knowledge about how to reduce the impact of family violence and how to prevent it happening. So I'm very excited.